morning, ladies and gentlemen. Always a pleasure to be in California, of course, coming from Montreal. It would even be more of a pleasure if it was February and minus 20 Celsius over there, but always good to be here. So IPv6 Enterprise was the theme for the day, and I work for a very small enterprise, which I think you know. It's called the Tata Group. Tata Communication is a small part of it. Of course, I think you all know the Tata Nano, the famous $2,000 car, which was developed by Tata Motors in India. By the way, they also bought a Jaguar and Land Rover. So I checked if I get a discount on the Land Rover, but no success so far. Then other parts of the family are Tata Steel, who bought the Chorus Group in Europe, which is the old British Steel and Hohovens. Then you have Tata Chemicals, you have the Taj Group, you have also the TCS, Tata Consulting Services, which is also a couple of 100,000 people. So all together, it's about a $90 billion conglomerate. I think Chairman has put as objective this year to reach 100 billion. And of course, you have quite a number of companies in there which are in the stock market by themselves, and each of them have their CIO and have their departments. So one could ask the questions, which of them are IPv6 ready? Again, it all depends on the definition. What is IPv6 ready? So within that group on the Tata Communication side, Tata Communication is in fact an amalgamation of three components. One is VSNL, which is the Indian international carrier, which was privatized, and the Tata Group bought it. Then they decided to go international, created VSNL International before, and they made two major acquisitions. One was the Tyco cable systems. Here in the US, they have transatlantic and trans-Pacific cables, and then Teleglobe, who is a major carrier of voice and data. That network was built out, and now it's a east-west globe-spanning network. So if you have Sandy on the east coast, all traffic goes west. If you have earthquake near Taiwan, it survives. If you have cable breaks near Alexandria, it survives too. So that's the claim. So on that global transmission network, which of course with new cables is the terabit range, we have the AS6453, and that's basically where I'm coming from. That's the old Teleglobe network, which is global. It's 4 terabit backbone. In fact, in the meantime, it's 4.3. With the addition of the new cables from India to the Gulf and from India to Marseille, I think that grew to more than 200 gig. That network is a wholesale network, so basically there are no end users or no enterprise customers on that network. The customers are around 500 ASs. If you trace route, there's a good chance you'll find 6453 somewhere. And on the IPv6 side, it's completely dual stack. So in theory, I could retire. My job is done. So now I can just sit back and enjoy and watch the traffic grow. But that's not completely true, because there's a domestic network in India and there's one in South Africa where the enterprise aspect is much more important. Now, IPv6 is ready for liftoff. If I look at the 500 odd AS customers, a majority of them are now coming dual stack. In fact, new customers or customers who renew, they get dual stack connection by default, unless they say that they don't want dual stack connectivity. So that grows nicely, and the whole ecosystem is growing quite nicely with it. Now, we've all heard over the years the famous IPv4 address depletion stories. Some of us have enjoyed the duels between Jeff Houston and Tony Haynes on when we would run out of IPv4 addresses. And I remember that Tony saying 2008 at one point in time, Jeff saying 2020, and it happened somewhere in the middle. And of course, we all know that APNIC ran out. That was a bit of a scare so soon after IANA, and now in September, at the RIPE meeting in Amsterdam, RIPE said they ran out, and ARIN forecast is for September 2013. So basically, the guessing game now is on a registry level instead of an IANA level. I think it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's completely futile. We ran out for all practical purposes. Now, what we all forget is IPv6 is really more than address format. I think the address affair is quite obvious. I think what was much more remarkable when we developed the whole IPv6 idea was to consider mobility. Again, more than 10 years ago, it was not obvious that mobility would one day dominate. And in fact, I think the real advantage of IPv6 in the whole mobility domain with NEMOs and MANIMOs and ad hoc networks, etc. Security has been downplayed, although I think we should play it up again. Famous correlation between DNSSEC and IPv6. Multicast is an unsung aspect. In fact, only the Japanese have been using multicast quite efficiently in that domain. Better QoS still is on the drawing list. A lot of talks about flow labels, etc., but not much has happened. Auto configuration, again, is a key for a home network. Again, it has to be ad hoc for sensor networks. You don't want to configure, plug and play, be it home, be it in the field of the military, you don't want to configure. And of course, all these little side benefits of permanent addresses, like a calling line ID, to know who calls is quite important. Traceability, addressability, you have to address your device which is somewhere out there. And of course, if you have an IP address-based billing one day, there's better one-to-one correlation between your address and your customer. To be behind the net, and you don't know who to bill, I think it's good for the consumer, but not for the revenue generation. Now, if I look back from that global network perspective, I think the famous June 8, 2011 peak disappeared a long time ago in the background noise. And at the end of the year, you had a number of major carriers and ISP really kicking the tires. And there we saw some blurbs. And of course, that traffic here, I should note, is based on a certain number of Arbor probes in the network. So this is not the total traffic, far from there. So if we now look at what happened since June of this year, week before June, paf, it grows. All the major content providers turn on IPv6, and it has been growing steadily ever since. And in fact, just end of last week, they installed 2 additional probes on the network, and surprise, surprise, traffic jumped up to 7 gig. So I don't have the latest graph here, but you can imagine that jumped to 7 gig. So there's traffic out there, and we don't know about it. So it's good. Now, I really don't care, because my argument with management in putting in that whole IPv6 capability was to say, our revenue is sigma v4 plus v6. I don't care about the mix, but we make revenue from both. And basically, by being v4 and v6 enabled, the famous time it takes to transit from one to the other becomes an invariable. I don't care. It can be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I'm ready. And in fact, the same reasoning applies to the major content providers. Question was raised, why is Google and Akamai, et cetera, interested in IPv6? It's, again, that business continuity aspect. Their business model depends on an accessible internet. There cannot be holes in that internet. So if one day there's an IPv6 only customer, they want to be able to serve that customer. If it's a v4 customer, he will be served also. So I think in their case, V4 and V6 will coexist for quite a long time because revenue is being made from the sum of both. If we look at the M6, the Amsterdam Exchange, which is one of the largest in the world, they see that growth also. If you look at the Google perspective, they see it grow. Yesterday we saw the Cisco Lab Graph. It's quite similar. So someone must be using it. And very interesting, a lot of people are using IPv6 without knowing it. At a number of conferences, it's now fashionable to turn on off IPv4. And we saw yesterday at the last Cisco Live, I think 3/4 of the people were using IPv6 and not knowing it. Though I'm a bit frustrated because living in Canada, I have Bell Canada's ISP, and they just sent a new modem 2 weeks ago because now it's fiber to the home. It's still not IPv6 ready. Now my daughter, who lives in France, in Strasbourg, has had IPv6 for the last 2 years. So she always said, "Dad, you talk about it, but I have it." And then she added, "What can I do with it?" That was a more difficult question, of course. And so I said, you can put sensors everywhere. You can remote feed your dog, the way Jordi Palette is doing. And she says, "Well, I'll think about it." One thing they did, though, is they put a server at home, and all their stuff is on the server. I'm even using their server in France to put some of my stuff on it. So IPv6 is useful. Alexa top 50, again, that's something which will set the trend. So what has happened since that famous IPv6 day? I think all major tier 1 carriers are now ready. On the eyeball networks, it's ready, also free in France. I mentioned Comcast is quite active here in the States, as we all know. LTE and mobile broadband, that's my preferred one. And of course, you have all the major content providers turned on, and now you have the government mandate. In fact, I think the US government is a big enterprise, and they really set the pace, and the rest of the world is following, including Canada. I've had the pleasure to chair the federal government task force in Canada, and they basically said to be a good follower is enough. And of course, Canada has one neighbor to the south. It's a small country called the United States. Now, if we extrapolate, IPv6, I think, went from an emergent to a mainstream happening this year. IPv6, 75% investigating, testing, currently using. Now, again, one has to be careful with these numbers. What does it really mean to be testing, to be using? Now, it's always interesting to see where these things lie on the hype cycle. Again, IPv6 is not a goal in itself. It's what can you do with it? And obviously, one has visions of that hyper-connected world where you have a number of subsets and some applications which are supposed to make money. Famous car-to-car communication is one of them. Remote healthcare is another one. And of course, everyone is in the clouds nowadays. And as we saw yesterday, cloud and IPv6 is really something complementary, and the two go hand in hand. We believe in cloud. We introduced cloud services in India for very small enterprises, and it's a tremendous success. I have to admit, these cloud services at this point in time are not IPv6, it's IPv4 only. But again, to grow and to be scalable, IPv6 needs to be included. I think Verizon has set the stage. When they first started, they set and mandated IPv6 in support for their handsets. And if you look at it today, they are #1 in the States, and I think we should all congratulate them, and the rest of the world is following. Now, besides the US, the leading countries are Korea and Japan with Docomo. Now, interesting enough, if we had meetings 5 years ago, nobody was talking about LTE. The first two networks were in the Nordic countries in Europe, end of 2009, and now it's growing by leaps and bounds. And if one looks at the projections of the number of smartphones, it's reaching 1 billion, I think, next year, according to some projections. And everything is going mobile. And again, the whole IPv6 aspect in that mobile environment with iPads and other iPhones and Androids and tablets, etc., will be there. And one interesting statistic, the one I like most, is the APNIC, and they show the IPv6 preference by originating AS. One could discuss and argue about the methodology, because from week to week the ranking changes, and we have to congratulate our Hurricane Electric, #1 in the US. And interesting enough, if you look, you have RDSnet, the Romanians are #1, they're a cable co, and again mandated the IPv6 support on their CPE devices. Free in France, they did the same thing with Prasad, and in fact they're using a 6RD, but again, they count as IPv6. And you will see here, you have on the Salco side our wireless players. So the wireless players are really coming along. You also see Google in the statistics. In fact, the most recent ones I just looked at yesterday, Microsoft is showing quite well, also as well as the Cisco side. So they're eating their own dog food, indeed. Amazing growth forecast. Again, I think you're all familiar with these aspects. The energy sector, I think, is another one we are looking at closely. Again, there's the Tata Power is quite an important component in the family also, and they also have a whole program to be green. Everyone wants to be green. And again, in order to do that, you need sensor networks, etc., which again is very good for IPv6, and we all know 6LoWPAN and ZigBee, etc., and all the standard struggles now going on. And in Canada, our BC Hydro, they placed an order for IPv6 enabled smart readers, and last week it was just reading that a small company here is LifeX, so a Wi-Fi enabled multicolor IPv6 LED bulb, and in fact yesterday Owen was also demonstrating a little setup to control his lights in IPv6. So it's all coming. Now, M2M, machine-to-machine communication, I think will impact all verticals, and some of you must read on a regular basis M2M world use, so machine-to-machine world use. Just in October, these tidbits, market in Europe, 1.5 billion, number of cellular M2M modules, the wireless industry revenue. So if you look at all of that, there is a lot of bacon there. Another aspect to look at if you want to choose your industry is the Ericsson three-wave scenario. So first wave, you had the network consumer electronics. Now, second wave, the network verticals. And I think choose one, and there's money to be made. And again, in all these aspects, you have security. And we're talking with Joe Klein yesterday about the scenarios where they hack into the system of your BMW and disable the brakes if they don't like you, or change the pressure in the gas tanks and things like that. So security is important. Future of payment, and this is another interesting aspect where you don't want to too much fraud, etc. And here I think the MasterCard, Visas of this world, and the carriers start to see they are quite complementary. Again, one of the reasons is security. Of course, the carriers try the famous secure SIM card approach in order to have their little piece in the action. And again, growing interest in IPv6 banking. I was mentioning yesterday in India, the banks were asking about ATM machines and IPv6, etc. And after some discussions, one of the banks said, hey, could we outsource to you the ATM machines, the automatic teller machines, not the asynchronous transfer mode, of course. So they outsource, and I think we're operating about 2,000 of these ATM machines quite efficiently, and we get revenue from the transaction part of that. So this is great. Again, you can use IPsec and IPv6 on it. You can also use dedicated point-to-point connections. So there is, on the application side, a lot to do. Clouds, we were mentioned, and anything as a service. And again, network as a service, infrastructure as a service, everything as a service. I'm not sure what that all means or implies, but everything becomes virtual. Right? Some people will say it's a phenomenon which will last a couple of years, then it will go back to the equipment. We'll see. Biggest enterprise of all, US. We have seen that, US government, we have seen that slide yesterday. Another way to look at it is the NIST ranking. And I think the industry and education sector should take notice. There have been a lot of criticism that the government has been late, but they're doing a commendable job. So congratulations, US government, you really set the pace for the rest of the world. So the US was considered to be late in IPv6. China was supposed to lead and be far ahead. Europe was supposed to be far ahead, but in the end, it's the US with practical initiative who's leading. Europe spends a lot of money, but have not much to show for. China is still doing their things in a closed environment. I think they will show up in the next year or two, and then, of course, with the sheer volume of their market, 3-4 years from now, they will surpass everyone else in adoption rates. The ranking for industry and education is quite interesting. I only saw 6 scoring in the 3 categories, so which means DNS, web, and mail. It's Brocade, it's Comcast, and it's Hurricane Electric. It's not much. I would encourage other companies to follow. Again, congratulations to the 3 of them, and Comcast is #1 because they also have DNSSEC. On the education sector, I thought there would be more, but there's only UCLA, Garner Webb, they're in North Carolina, and Weber State in Utah. So there's still a long way to go in enterprise adoption and education adoption here. Corporate spending for next year, data centers, cloud. I have seen nobody who really has a lot of separate budget items for IPv6. So they think it's a transient irritant, but it will be solved. Now, to conclude, going into next year, we've seen that, and I think everyone agrees, is to mandate immediate IPv6 support on all procurements. That's the way I did it at Teleglobe and Tata. Never asked for a budget for IPv6. It just came from the normal growth. Make public-facing services accessible. I think that's a low-hanging fruit. Again, are you ready when you have done that? I don't think you're ready, but it's a necessary first step. And start assessing possible impact on all IP address-dependent back-office processes. And I think the next step will be, especially for major companies, to see what Oracle, IBM, Accenture are getting to have their big systems ready in the back office. And of course, train some key engineering and operations staff. So in conclusion, I was discussing with Bruce this morning the meaning of the famous IPv6 readiness stated by enterprise, like Europe would be leading, followed by Asia. Again, it all depends what you say. If my website is IPv6 ready, am I IPv6 ready? It's questionable. And in my opinion, #1 is definitely the States. Thank you.